Hello, welcome to the Babylonian. This season of the Babylonian, we're going to be exploring the New Testament Apocrypha. I'm Peter and I'll be the co-host for this season. If you're interested in learning a little bit more, you can find summaries and notes in thebabylonian.com. If you don't know where that is, you can find it in the description below. With that being said, with sages, scholars, and the scriptures, let's Bible on.
Okay, we're going through the New Testament Apocrypha. We're going through the infancy Gospels. We are going to be going through an exceptionally short infancy Gospel today called the Arundel 404 or the Liber de Infantia Salvatoris, which I think means the book of the infant savior. And by short, I mean we're going to read the whole thing and talk about it in this podcast episode. We're talking short. Yeah. So this is the author claims to be James in one manuscript and Matthew in another. Remember, we have the Gospel Pseudo Matthew and we have the Proto Evangelium of James. So I'm not sure why Matthew is a popular pick for talking about Jesus when he's young. I get James. That's at least his legal brother, according to a lot of these texts. Not really his half-brother. And we get Thomas, even if it's Gnostic and not really understanding Didymus correct, which we talk about that whole thing at the beginning of our Infancy Gospel Thomas episode. Matthew, I don't know. I'm not sure where that comes from. But one manuscript says this is Matthew and another says this is James. This is Docetic, Gnostic. Do you know what that is? Do you know about that?
I think we mentioned it in an earlier episode.
Docetism?
Yeah, it's very similar to Gnosticism, and I think it precedes it historically, like it happens a little earlier, but I don't know much more than that. I think maybe dualism is a part of it.
Yeah, I think that it has that, but on top of that, it's dualistic, but it's also adds on that Jesus is, I think it's like his humanity is kind of lessened in his divinity. Like his divinity makes him less human in a sense. And we'll see that in this text, which is crazy because it's one pericope. It's one, which is like a short section, a narrative. It's referred to in the Galatian Decree, and it was based on the Proto-Evangelium of James, Pseudo-Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of the Birth of Mary. And so it could have been based on the Proto-Evangelium of James through the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, or just directly, or based on both. But either way, this infancy gospel is literally just the narrative, at least what we have from it is just the narrative of Jesus being born to Mary. So I'm just going to read through it and then we can discuss it. So it says, in that hour, a great silence descended with fear, for even the wind stopped. They made no breeze. There was no movement of the leaves on the trees, nor sound of water heard. The streams did not flow. There was no motion of the sea. All things born in the water silent. All things were silent. No human voice sounded, and there was a great silence. For the pole itself ceased its rapid course from that hour. The measure of time almost stopped. Everyone was overwhelmed with great fear and kept silent. We were expecting the advent of the Most High God, the end of the world. Okay, this is pretty freaking dope already, but just wait, it's going to ruin everything. As the time drew near, the power of God showed itself openly. The maiden stood looking into heaven. She became like a vine. Okay, interesting. For now, the end of events of salvation was at hand. When the light had come forth, Mary worshipped him, whom she saw she had given birth to. The child himself, like the sun, shone brightly, beautiful and most delightful to see, because he alone appeared as peace, bringing peace everywhere. In that hour when he was born, the light of many invisible beings proclaimed in unison, Amen. And that light which was born was multiplied, and it obscured the light of the sun itself by its shining rays. The cave was filled with the bright light, with a most sweet smell. The light was born just as the dew descends from heaven to the earth, for its perfume is fragrant beyond all the smell of ointments. I, however, stood stupefied and amazed. This is the midwife who's talking about this. Seized me. I was gazing at the intense bright light which had been born. The light, however, gradually shrank, imitated the shape of an infant, then immediately became outwardly an infant like a child born normally. I became bold and leaned over and touched him. I lifted him in my hands with great awe, and I was terrified because he had no weight like other babies who were born. I looked at him. There was no blemish in him, but his whole body was shining, just as the dew of the Most High God. He was light to carry, radiant to see. For a while, I was amazed at him because he did not cry, as newborn infants are accustomed to cry. While I held him, looking into his face, he smiled at me with the most joyful smile, and, opening his eyes, he looked at me intently. And suddenly, a great light came forth from his eyes like a brilliant flash of lightning.
Wow.
That's it.
Well, you know what that makes me think of? It makes me think of the little drummer boy. Because it ends with, then he smiled at me. And so, perhaps, well, I would say this one probably is more likely to influence the little drummer boy song than vice versa, due to,
Hey, the oral tradition for the little drummer boy might just go back, Peter. You don't want to doubt that.
We don't know. Maybe whoever wrote it, they had been hearing stories that have been passed down through generations. Wow. Well, can I share some thoughts that I have right off the bat when I listen to that?
Well, I just wanted to say first that I thought it was interesting that you mentioned the little drummer boy, because I was thinking of Silent Night, because nobody says anything. I thought that's what you were going to say. I was like, oh, we're on the same wavelength, but that's apparently like all these like great Christmas hymns. Well, the Silent Night one, that kind of ruins it, because it's like, ooh, now, I'm kind of hearing the Docetism in that,
Well, wasn't there a Christmas song that like kind of challenged the Silent Night, and it like one of their lyrics is it wasn't a silent night?
Ooh, they throwing shade.
I believe explicitly says that. I don't know. I'm not an expert on Christmas music today, but I think there's one that explicitly says, and perhaps they're not trying to challenge the Docetism of that. Maybe they are. If that is I would caution anyone from assuming some kind of heresy about Silent Night without being more explicit and being able to identify that. But maybe they are trying to, in their effort, highlight the humanness of the reality of Jesus being born, because it was a human experience, which I think this apocryphal text gets wrong.
Yeah. Well, if it's emphasizing his humanity, it is explicitly anti-docetistic, docetic, but not that Silent Night is. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that a song that's being sung by churches all around the world isn't docetistic, because that's pretty. If that was, I was pretty. And even if I'm singing that, like I sing that song, and I'm not like I'm not tripping over that verse, but like this text here mentioning it is, and I don't think that it's all the way, but it does kind of. Jesus is okay. Fancy theological term, and now I'm like going over my head, but the word is impassible. So God is impassible, which means, he's not like influenced or overcome by emotions. But, in the same way that Jesus, like there's just this more complicated like way in which Jesus's human and divine natures work together. And so in this, it's kind of like his divinity overcomes his humanity, and he just like straight up doesn't have emotions. Is like he's kind of like a boy, but he's not really a boy in this text. So
when you're saying impassible, you're saying this text is different from the Orthodox view of impassibility, in that this text is saying that Jesus doesn't have emotions, but impassibility says Jesus has emotions, but they wouldn't cause him to make sinful decisions, or they would not influence him to.
It's not going to change it. It's not going to be like, oh, I'm making this decision out of my like grief or anger, like I would like, it's like clouding your judgment, I guess this is what I'm probably talking over my head at this point, but like,
I don't know. I personally like, what were you saying?
Yeah. Like, I guess my point wasn't, and when I mentioned impassibility, I actually originally wasn't really trying to make a point about this text saying something to that, as much as like, I just forget, like, but the church fathers had this whole, or when they were explaining like how that whole thing works within his humanity and his divinity being united in person, and in this, it's just kind of like, it's like if his humanity is wine, it's like diluted by like if his humanity is water, it's like it's diluted in all this wine, and all you can taste and see is like
Is the wine. Yeah.
his divinity. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do want to point out with that, I don't know too much about impassibility, but I do think, contrary to what some people may say, emotions play a valuable part in our decision making, and we can't really make decisions without emotions. So I think I was listening to a fantastic book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. And I'm sure I actually can remember talking to you about this book a couple times. But one thing they talked about is how people's decision making is determined by, like, emotions are involved in that. And Jesus is human. We believe Jesus is human. And anyway, so they talked about how, like, when one part of the brain was removed that caused people to have some kind of emotions, they weren't able to make decisions. So anyway, don't read farther into my explanation of Chris Voss than is necessary.
Yeah.
Chris Voss's book, and that way I'm not putting words into his mouth, or but so anyway.
Yeah, and that is important. And I probably shouldn't have mentioned anything because I just don't know enough, but I think they're talking more philosophically speaking, and not as much that he doesn't have emotions, because Jesus obviously has emotions. He turns over tables and calls people out and stuff, Matthew 23, but the point is that, like, his emotions don't overcome him, which is, like, again, I'm not sure, like, at what point would you say that? I don't know. Yeah, I should.
Yeah, it's a really blurry line there. Is he influenced? To what extent is he more influenced by? Going back to it, I guess. Okay, the big thing that I saw that I noticed was there's the light and it's shining, and then it starts to become like a human. And I guess what I'm assuming the implication there is that when Jesus was born, he came out of Mary as completely God and then became human. Is that what they're implying, or something similar to that? What do you thought? What are you thinking they're implying there?
Yeah, it says that there was like this light, and then this light becomes like a person. Let me see. So it says, "Fear seized me. I was gazing intensely at the intense bright light which had been born." So the light had been born. And then the light, however, gradually shrank, imitated the shape of an infant, then immediately became outwardly an infant, like a child born normally. So like Mary gives birth to light, and I don't think they're thinking of like physical protons. So I'm not sure like what it is that they're imagining.
But they're implying that he has to reduce the amount of godness he's like in order to become human.
Yeah.
Or they're saying that being like God is actually just hidden inside the shell of a human. So he looks human. He might talk like a human, but he's not really human. He's God with a human body, which is different than him being completely human and completely God.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I will say the thing that I find interesting about this. So I actually really liked like the first, the end is drawing near, the time of salvation. Like that is so like, this is like really dope. But then it's like, man, when it drops, when the beat drops, it's like, okay, this is funky. But like in English, as much as it's heretical, it is kind of cool, the kind of double entendre that this makes in English, because light refers to not just brilliance and radiance, but also like a lack of weight. So it's kind of like in this, Jesus isn't just like the bright light of the world, he's like the lightweight of the world. So I don't know, I was like thinking of like, oh, like this, this has to be the title of this episode, the lightweight of the world, just because I think that's so clever, which is also like unfortunate because it's like, it's Docetism.
Yeah.
But
can I try to unpack that real quick? When you're saying the light weight of the world, meaning that there's no physical light, no physical weight, or no weight lifting him, like you can't feel his weight, implies that Jesus probably doesn't have matter in the same sense that we do. So it's dualistic, saying that the physical world is not as good as the spiritual world.
Yeah, exactly. Which is also interesting because now that I'm thinking about it, like no text that I've read, like Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Second Temple, whatever, has ever gone into like the details of like what it's like to like encounter physically like a spiritual being. And here, we're talking with like heretics, who are claiming Jesus isn't really human, but is just appearing like one. But it is really interesting that it's like, I guess that's how like most people would imagine it, appearing as something bright. Of course, Jesus is like God himself, but also bright. It's like they have no weight and like they're awesome. So I don't know. That's an interesting thing. But yeah, it's like it says, it's like it appears like an infant, but it's not really like, it's not really like an infant. And I guess in this story, because what's born from Mary is light and then it forms like an infant, I guess Jesus doesn't have a belly button, unless you're one of those people that argues that Adam has a belly button, in which case, already you have a lot of groundwork to make up with like, Genesis 2:7 and all that. But yeah, so
Wow.
it's interesting.
Well, I do want to say I like, and you mentioned this before, I like how they put a huge emphasis on the significance of Jesus being born and how that is a issue for all of creation. And so even though if everyone is gasping, if everyone's stopped and they're startled and they're in terror, I think it describes them as being in terror.
Yeah.
And it does seem to reduce the significance of having it be an event that was exclusively for the shepherds, the least of these. So
that's a good point.
That
There was a local,
a little bit of a problem. Yeah.
Jesus is also helping out small businesses. He was looking out for that one inn that his parents stayed at to give birth.
So for application, go to your local coffee shop or your local burger place.
Local hospital to give birth.
Local bookstore. Oh yeah, hospital is more applicable here. Yeah. Or
but
you could hire someone to come to your house if you would like to as well, if that's appealing to you.
Yeah, you're right. This is kind of like this is kind of like in the original Gospels, Jesus would make for like a great like political figure, like I've been with the locals from the beginning. But here, I guess like on the other hand, he does have everybody recognizing at his birth, which I wonder like if they're thinking about people also, all we have is this one narrative, so we don't know, but I wonder if they're also thinking of people down in like Egypt. I don't know. I guess if it's like that much brighter than the sun, then I guess like you're just like flashed from like whatever angle of the compass this is coming from, in which case that would be pretty freaky if something brighter than the sun was like coming out of any side of my vision. But yeah, that's a good point though. Like this is something that it makes it more real. Like you said, Jesus is appearing to like the lowliest people first. Like the Magi, by the way, come when Jesus is 2, because
they're not coming
to
right
kill
at
the 2-year-olds. Yeah.
Fix your nativity set again. If you missed the episode in Pseudo Matthew,
you're missing out.
Adjustment to your nativity set is the wise men have to be a little bit further out because they're not there yet. So
yeah.
But what else did you think about this one?
I mean, that's it for me, to be honest. I mean, it's really disappointing because you read everything and like up until the last part, it's like, dude, this is so dope. Like the end is coming, the fulfillment of all salvation, like everything stopped, which also seems to be connected. I wonder if this is kind of like they had in mind the same thing as, if you remember in the Proto-Evangelium of James, I read that one story where, Joseph sees the shepherds and they're about to strike the sheep, but then they don't strike it. And it's like, this is happening, but it's not happening. And everything slows down. And like, and this here, like literally says that it's like it's as if time itself had stopped. It says something to that effect, so it seems like a similar thing, which is like, it's interesting. I've never read in all the literature, even at this point, I've read all the New Testament Apocrypha in this edition, and I don't see anything like it. So it's very interesting. I wonder if this is like a novel thing or if this is in other literature at the time. But yeah, those are all my thoughts though. I mean, as far as orthodoxy index, I'd give this a 3 because like all that we're given about Jesus is that he's like not human, which is terrible. But it's talking about like the fulfillment of salvation, and it has like, that stuff is pretty cool. And I feel like I have to give, a 3 for that. So yeah, I don't know. You had any other thoughts on this?
Well, a little leaven leavens the whole lump of bread.
Yeah.
And I think because I gave that illustration there, we got to give it a 0. I'll give it a 1. I'll give it a 1 because it does have that good statement. But I think it's worth pointing out, for someone who is pretty spot on, you have to wait a long time to hear them mess up in their words. And if you only say a paragraph or you only say so much and you mess up, I think that tells you a little bit about what you think. So with that being said, I think I'll give him a 2. We'll be gracious and I'll give him a 2. But like, yeah, I think we'll give him about a 2. So
that's a good point. If this was a page and they already like committed a pretty bad heresy, like I'm not sure I want to see what they would make of like if they had anything based on the infancy gospel of Thomas.
yeah, but I think it's worth pointing out, just as we want to be cautious thinking about these New Testament Apocrypha and like, hey, what's the implication of that? In some sense, you could make the case that Christmas songs are also New Testament Apocrypha.
Mm.
Just like if you don't understand that, listen to our first episode or the first episode in this series. And so, you know, like it is worth thinking about like what's going on here. What are the subtle implications of even saying it was a silent night or it wasn't a silent night? What is the author saying about what they think the birth of Jesus was like? So, yeah.
What are the theological, the subconscious assumptions, presuppositions behind whatever you're singing, you know, about the drummer boy? Think about the drummer boy. What does that mean? But yeah,
He smiled
also,
at
like you
me.
said, right there, all the, you know, fills every biblical motif. Yeah, that's good. All right. This has been the Arundel for closing up on the infancy gospels. Next time, we're going to talk about the last infancy gospel. But until then, make sure to Bible on.